For centuries, humankind has studied, debated, and explored the possible locations of the legendary Atlantis civilization. Its sole chronicler was the revered philosopher Plato, who, in the 4th century BC, described it as a prosperous and idyllic island paradise, peopled by descendants of the sea god Poseidon, some 12,000 years ago. According to his account, the large island abounded in lush vegetation, diverse animal species, and many precious metals, with magnificent public buildings and trading canals spreading out from its city centre. However, although said to be technologically advanced, the godlike nature of Atlantis' citizens and the society they had created faded over generations, and they became avaricious and warfaring. These changes resulted in what some saw as the gods taking revenge on the faithless people, with what is described as a cataclysm of gigantic proportions. Evidently, violent earthquakes and flooding engulfed the island state, which disappeared into the depths of the sea. A steady stream of scholars, scientists, historians, archaeologists, and Nobel Prize winner Sir Frederick Soddy has studied, theorised, explored and excavated over centuries, seeking the location of the famed civilization without any obvious success. Practically every country in the world has been identified with Atlantis at one time or another, with the world still no closer to solving the geographical puzzle of its previous whereabouts. However, one astonishing theory put forward by researchers Rose and Rand Flem-Ath, while seeming far-fetched, has captured our imagination and on further examination is persuasively evidence-based. Here are 5 powerful arguments why the lost island state of Atlantis may in fact be lying under miles of thick ice in the Antarctic. Number 5. The location within the world ocean. Plato stated that his telling of the history of Atlantis was wholly true and based on the findings of Solon, an Athenian lawmaker who is considered the founder of democracy. Solon travelled to Egypt, where he learned about the demise of Atlantis from a highly educated priest called Sontius. It should be noted that the ancient Egyptians were meticulous historians who were obsessive about time accuracies, keeping records in their sacred archives. Plato later recounted Sontius' information that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, that is, what is now called the Straits of Gibraltar, which was the boundary of the then known world, and at a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean. In order to correctly interpret this statement, we need to be aware that the limited perspective of the ancient Greeks viewed the Atlantic Ocean as the only ocean in the world. It was not until much later in the 15th and 16th centuries that explorers ventured into and named the Pacific and Indian Oceans and differentiated between the water masses and sailing routes. Therefore, restricting the search for Atlantis to only the Atlantic Ocean has been a historical error. Findings of the newly developed science of oceanic geography in the 20th century, with subsequent oceanographic studies of the seabed and the formation of continents, have further confirmed this error, because nowhere in the 100 million square kilometres of the Atlantic is there any evidence of either a destroyed continent or the kind of cataclysm which caused it. Accordingly, Sontius had told Solon that the Mediterranean Sea was only a bay of the real ocean, and that Atlantis was in the middle of the real or world ocean. When we place Antarctica in the centre of a world map, the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans appear as one body of water, where oceanographers called the world ocean encircling it. In Atlantean times, 9,600 years BC, the other continents formed a surrounding continuous outer ring, with the Americas and Afro-Euro-Asia continents joined by a land bridge called Beringia. Number 4. The theory of Earth crust displacement. Many people are aware of the existence of the Earth's tectonic plates, the slow shifting of which results in natural disasters such as earthquakes and tidal waves. Adding to this notion, it has also been theorised that more dramatic and abrupt movements of the Earth's crust have caused major events such as mass extinctions and glaciation patterns. An anthropologist, Charles Hapgood, developed this theory of Earth crust displacement in the early 1950s, and the great physicist Albert Einstein agrees with him that the virtually rigid outer crust of the Earth undergoes, from time to time, extensive displacement, apparently quite suddenly. An Earth crust displacement is a rapid shifting of the entire outer shell of the Earth over its molten inner layers. Rather than moving continents in relation to each other, as in the theory of plate tectonics, in an Earth crust displacement, all the continents and the ocean basins that they are connected to move as a single unit over the inner layers of the planet. This shift happens at lightning speed compared with plate tectonics, so that the phenomenon accords with the shocking rapidity and violence of the weather events recorded in Plato's account of the end of Atlantis. The last Earth crust displacement is estimated to have occurred in 9600 BC, the date that Plato had set for the destruction of Atlantis. Just prior to that event, the part of the Earth's surface that was directly over the North Pole was the ocean-covered part of North America, known as Hudson Bay. During that time, most of the present-day eastern USA was within the Arctic Circle, a polar region covered with an ice sheet. Most of Alaska, on the other hand, was outside of the polar zone and was capable of providing the grasslands and mild climate to sustain millions of very large mammals, none of which could survive there today. When we look at the exact opposite side of the globe, we soon see the Lesser Antarctica, the tail pointing to South America. It was temperate like its counterpart in the Northern Hemisphere, while Greater Antarctica, the largest part towards Australia, was polar. The researchers believed that Lesser Antarctica was the location of what Plato called Atlantis. Number 3. Ancient mapping. The Flemath's theory was first inspired by the sighting of an ancient Egyptian map, which accurately depicted the subglacial geography of the Antarctic continent. The map had somehow survived the Crusader Dandelo's hate-fueled destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria in the year 1204. Centuries later, in 1665, the map had been found and published by an exemplary cartographic researcher called Athanasius Kircher, who at that time described it as the lost island of Atlantis. The Flemaths argue that this map could not have been drawn by European sailors of that time, not only because the subglacial structures of Antarctica was not visible, but also because sailors were unable to produce accurate maps until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. In interpreting the map, it needs to be understood that the ancient Egyptians saw the direction of where the headwaters of the sacred Nile connect with the sun as south, so that the map needs to be viewed upside down to accord with the modern depiction of the globe. In doing so, the map represents, in size, shape, scale and position, an ice-free Antarctica, astonishingly revealed almost 3 centuries before human technology was able to determine the true ice-free shape of the continent in 1958. The present shape of Antarctica is based on current sea levels, not those of 11,600 years ago, and Atlantis did not sink into the ocean as described in Plato's tale. Instead, as the old ice caps melted, the sea levels rose to cover large parts of the continent. Further distortions in our modern maps are due to the weight of the Antarctic ice sheet. The shadow of Atlantis can still be seen in modern cartography of Antarctica. Number 2. Evidence of a dispersed civilization. After reading Plato's account of the destruction of Atlantis, the Flemaths studied ancient civilizations from across the world and discovered a common theme in their mythological heritages. Across diverse and scattered cultures, they discovered similar stories of massive flooding causing the destruction of a bountiful native land, a narrative already recorded in ancient Egyptian archives. Again and again, the description of a catastrophic deluge and lost island paradise emerged. The researchers called this common theme the sun deluge motif. There are many examples. The Haida tribe of northwest Canada believed that before a great flood, their ancestors lived in a magnificent city in a distant land. Their arrival at the Queen Charlotte Islands, which are their home, has been dated at almost 12,000 years ago by archaeologists, therefore coincided with Plato's estimate of the time of the destruction of Atlantis. On the other side of the globe, in Iraq, ancient remains have been discovered from the Sumerian peoples, dating back millennia. 35,000 tablets containing written records have detailed the very roots of the Sumerian civilization as originating in Dilmun, a mountainous island in the ocean. The stories of both the Haida and ancient Sumerians are almost identical. Life was good until a sky god decided to destroy mankind by bringing a worldwide flood, and survivors escaped in large boats which took them to a new land, where they took refuge on a mountain. Many other native Canadian and American tribes have long held legends with similar sun deluge stories. Diverse American native mythology also honours in separate myths 4 westerly mountains as sites of ancestral survival following the Great Flood. Mounts Baker, Jefferson, Rainier and Shasta, all attributed with providing refuge to survivors of the deluge. The Cherokees had a similar myth about the Appalachians, as do the people of Central and South America, with historical trauma causing a ritualistic rush to the high mountains whenever there is an earthquake. The Aztec Empire built great pyramids symbolizing the mountains which had saved their ancestors from the floods. Parallel traditional tales exist in Indian, Iranian and Japanese oral history. The people of Atlantis may have fled to all corners of the globe, as evidence in these similar stories found in all known ancient cultures throughout Europe and the Middle East. The sun deviates from its usual course, the sky falls, and there follow massive earthquakes and tidal waves. Accordingly, the Flemaths have described how significant pyramids and sacred sites in Latin America and Asia are linked by 10-degree intervals from the Great Pyramid in Egypt. These connections, spread so far apart, suggest the existence of a long-lost advanced civilization originating within a single culture, but then dispersed across the globe. Such a conclusion is so far unvalidated by archaeology, although one geologist, Robert Schock, has concluded that the Sphinx predates the pyramids by over 4,000 years, and that its weathering is not caused by wind-blown sand, but water erosion caused long before Egypt was a desert. Number 1. The rise of agriculture. Sumeria is considered by archaeologists to be the first civilization to rise after Atlantis, and radiocarbon dating at a site called Tel Abu Huraya shows that by 9500 BC there were the first signs of the transition from hunter-gathering to farming, the cultivation of grain crops and domestication of wild animals such as rabbits, goats and sheep. Plato, also based on ancient Egyptian records, dates the origins of agriculture at approximately 9600 BC, just after the Earth crust displacement. It has been shown by a dedicated botanical researcher, Nikolai Vavilov, that there is a direct correlation between the centres of origin of the world's most cultivated food plants and the Earth's highest mountain ranges. The shock and fear created by the events described in handed down sun deluge narratives meant that survivors of the Great Flood were terrified of a similar event, and so settled at higher altitudes, cultivating their own food supplies rather than roaming the land to hunt and gather. Ancient Peruvian mythology states that gods brought agriculture and a civilized life to their regions. In other words, people who already had agricultural skills and knowledge but had been forced to leave their homeland when it was destroyed by floods. According to Plato, the Atlanteans were accomplished food cultivators, building elaborate canals for the irrigation of fields and orchards and the feeding of livestock. With their displacement to highland locations, a few had the skills to select wild grasses and other plants suitable for producing large-scale food sources. When these well-nourished people finally descended to the lower plains, they may well have been regarded as superhuman by the local populations living on a subsistence hunter-gatherer diet. Three main sites of the first food cultivation have been dated back to the earth crust displacement of 9600 BC. Crops of rice at Spirit Cave in the highlands of Thailand, potatoes at Lake Titicaca in the central Andes, and millet in the highlands of Ethiopia. The unfortunately destructive process of global warming, with the melting of ice caps at the South Pole, may start to show us over time whether the Flamat's theory on the location of Atlantis is correct. Indeed, one observer seemed to have located evidence in the Antarctic of an ancient-looking pyramid partially revealed. The Flammaths have even gone so far as to conjecture where the remains of the ill-fated metropolis may be found. The city of Atlantis was designed as a series of concentric circles with canal access to a bay, and the Flammaths believe its location to be northwest of the Whitmore Mountains. The legend of Atlantis lives on, but now with more compelling evidence of its actual existence. Ancient writings from many cultures around the globe proclaiming a past civilization that had advanced techniques in construction and agriculture, as well as scientific proof that the world-changing cataclysm they describe really occurred thousands of years ago. Archaeologists continue to dig up the past and at times have rewritten history. If or when the Antarctic ice cap melt, will archaeologists uncover this fabled land called Atlantis and finally put the matter to rest? Or will it only reveal a rocky landmass buried under ice? For now it appears the search for Atlantis will continue.